We'll start with Unit 3, that is Current Challenges Facing the Indian Economy. Some of the most challenging issues facing India today are poverty, development of rural India, and building infrastructure. We are a billion-strong country today, and our human capital is biggest asset. It needs investment in health and education. We also need to understand the concept of employment and the need for creating more employment in our country. We will also look at the implications of development on our environment and call for sustainable development. There is a need to critically assess government initiatives in tackling all these issues, each of which has been taken up separately in this unit. Poverty. After studying this chapter, the learners will understand the various attributes of poverty, comprehend the diverse dimensions relating to the concept of poverty, critically appreciate the way poverty is estimated, appreciate and able to assess existing poverty alleviation programs. No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Adam Smith. Introduction. In the previous chapters, you have studied the economic policies that India has taken in the last 5.5 decades and the outcome of these policies with relation to various developmental indicators, providing minimum basic needs to the people and reduction of poverty have been the major aims of independent India. The pattern of development that the successive 5-year plans envisaged laid emphasis on the upliftment of poorest of poor, Antyodaya, integrating the poor into the mainstream and achieving a minimum standard of living for all. While addressing the Constituent Assembly in 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru had said, "This achievement, independence, is but a step, an opening of opportunity to the great triumph and achievements that await us, the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity." However, we need to know where we stand today. Poverty is not only a challenge for India, as more than 1/5 of the world's poor live in India alone, but also for the world. There more than 260 million people are not able to meet their basic needs. Poverty has many faces, which have been changing from place to place and across time, and has been described in many ways. Most often, poverty is a situation that people want to escape. So, poverty is a call to action for the poor and the wealthy alike. A call to change the world so that many more may have enough to eat, adequate shelter, access to education and health, protection from violence, and voice in what happens in their communities. To know what helps to reduce poverty, what works and what does not, what changes over time, poverty has to be defined, measured, and studied, and even experienced. As poverty has many dimensions, it has to be looked at through a variety of indicators: level of income and consumption, social indicators, and indicators of vulnerability to risk, and socio-political access. So these are the things: social indicators and indicators of vulnerability to risk. Who are the poor? You would have noticed that in all localities and neighborhoods, both in rural and urban areas, there are some of us who are poor and some who are rich. Read the story of Anu and Sudha. Their lives are examples of two extremes. It's in box 4.1. There are also people who belong to many stages in between. So I'll read the table first and then we'll go back. Anu and Sudha. Anu and Sudha were both born on the same day. Anu's mother and father were construction workers and Sudha's father was businessman and her mother a designer. Anu's mother worked by carrying head loads of bricks until she went into labor. She then went behind the tool shed on the construction site and delivered her baby alone. She fed her child and then wrapped her in a old sari, made a cradle with ghani sack, put little Anu in it and hang it from a tree. She hurried back to the work as she was afraid she would lose her job. She hoped that Anu would sleep until evening. Sudha was born in one of the best nursing homes in the city. She was thoroughly checked by doctors. She was bathed and dressed in clean, soft cloths and placed in a crib next to her mother. Her mother fed her whenever she was hungry, hugged and kissed her, and sang her to sleep. Her family and friends celebrated her arrival. Anu and Sudha had very different childhoods. Anu learned to look after herself at a very early age. She knew what hunger and deprivation were. She discovered how to pick food from the dustbin, how to keep warm during the winter, to find shelter in the monsoon, and how to play with pieces of string, stones, and twigs. Anu could not go to school as her parents were migrant workers who kept moving from city to city in search of work. Anu loved to dance. Whenever she heard music, she would improvise. She was very beautiful and her movements were graceful and evocative. Her dream was to dance on a stage someday. Anu could have become a great dancer, but she had to begin work at age of 12. She had to earn a living with her mother and father, building houses for the rich, houses she would never live in. Sudha went to a very good playing school where she learned how to read, write, and count. She went on excursions to the planetarium, museum, and national parks. She later went to very good school. She loved painting and started getting private lessons from a famous artist. She later joined a design school and became a well-known painter. There are also people who belong to many of stages in between. Push cart vendors, street cobblers, women who string flowers, rag pickers, vendors and beggars are some examples of poor and vulnerable groups in urban areas. They possess few assets. They reside in kacha hutments with wall made of baked mud and roof made of grass, thatch, bamboo and wood. The poorest of them do not even have such dwellings. In rural areas, many of them are landless. Even if some of them possesses land, it is only dry or waste land. Many do not get to have even 2 meals a day. Starvation and hunger are the key features of poorest households. The poor lack basic literacy and skills and hence have very limited economic opportunities. Poor people also face unstable employment. Malnutrition is alarmingly high among the poor. Ill health, disability, or serious illness makes them physically weak. They borrow from money lenders who charge high rates of interest that lead them into chronic indebtedness. The poor are highly vulnerable. They are not able to negotiate their legal wages from employers and are exploited. Most poor households have no access to electricity. Their primary cooking fuel is firewood and cow dung cake. A large section of poor people do not even have access to safe drinking water. There is evidence of extreme gender inequality in the participation of gainful employment. education, and in decision making within the family. Poor women receive less care on their way to motherhood. Their children are less likely to survive or to born healthy. Scholars identify the poor on the basis of their occupation and ownership of assets. Yeah. They state that the rural poor work mainly as the landless agricultural laborers, cultivators with very small land holdings, landless laborers who are engaged in variety of non-agricultural jobs, and tenants cultivators with small land holdings. The urban poor are largely the overflow of the rural poor who had migrated to urban areas in search of alternative employment and livelihood, laborers who do a variety of casual jobs, and the self-employed who sell a variety of things on roadside and are engaged in various activities. What is poverty? Two scholars, Shaheen Rafi Khan and Damian Killen, put the condition of poor in nutshell. Poverty is hunger. Poverty is being sick and not being able to go see a doctor. Poverty is not being able to go to school and not knowing how to read. Poverty is not having job. Poverty is fear of future. Having food once in a day. Poverty is losing a child to illness brought about by unclear water. Poverty is powerlessness, lack of representation and freedom. What do you think? Yeah. How are poor people identified? If India is to solve the problem of poverty, it has to find viable and sustainable strategy to address the causes of poverty and design schemes to help the poor out of their situation. However, for these schemes to be implemented, the government needs to be able to identify who the poor are. For this, there is need to develop a scale to measure poverty, and the factors that makes up the criteria for this measurement or mechanism need to be carefully chosen. In pre-independent India, Dadabhai Navroji was the first to discuss the concept of poverty line. He used the menu for prisoner and used appropriate prevailing prices to arrive at what may be called jail cost of living. However, only adults stay in jail, whereas in an actual society there are children too. He therefore appropriately adjusted this cost of living to arrive at a poverty line. For this adjustment, he assumed 1/3 population consisted of children and half of them consumed very little while the other half consumed half of the adult diet. This is how he arrived at the factor of 3/4. Okay. The weighted average of consumption of three segments gives the average poverty line, which comes out to be 3/4 of adult jail cost of living. The post-independent India, there have been several attempts to work out a mechanism to identify number of poor in country. For instance, in 1962, the Planning Commission formed a study group. In 1979, another body called the Task Force on Projection of Minimum Needs and Effective Consumption Demand was formed. In 1989, an expert group was constituted for same purpose. Besides these bodies, many individual economists have also attempted to develop such a mechanism. For the purpose of defining poverty, we divide people into two categories, the poor and non-poor. And the poverty line separates the two. However, there are many kinds of poor: the absolutely poor, the very poor, and the poor. Similarly, there are various kinds of non-poor. middle class, upper middle class, the rich. The very rich and the absolute rich. Think of this as a line or continuum from the very poor to the absolute rich, with the poverty line dividing the poor from non-poor. Categorizing poverty. There are many ways to categorize poverty. In one such way, people who are always poor and those who are usually poor but who may sometimes have a little more money, example casual workers, are grouped together as a chronic poor. Another group are churning poor, who regularly move in and out of poverty. Example small farmers and seasonal workers. And the occasionally poor who are rich most of the time but may sometimes have a patch of bad luck. They are called transient poor. And then there are those who are never poor and they are non-poor. The poverty line. Now let us examine how to determine poverty line. There are many ways of measuring poverty. One way is to determine it by the monetary value, per capita expenditure of the minimum calorie intake that was estimated at 2400 calories for rural person and 2100 per person in an urban area. Based on this, in 1999-2000, the poverty line was defined for rural areas as consumption worth rupees 328 per person a month, and for urban areas it was rupees 454. Though the government uses monthly per capita expenditure as proxy for income of households to identify the poor, do you think this mechanism satisfactorily identifies poor households in our country? Monthly per capita expenditure. See, we have seen this. Always poor, usually poor. These are chronic poor. And these two, if you say transient, that again we have churning poor and occasionally poor, and then never poor. Scholars state that a major problem with this mechanism is that it groups all the poor together and does not differentiate between the very poor and the poor. Though this mechanism takes consumption expenditure on food and few select items as proxy for income, economists question its basis. This mechanism is helpful in identifying a poor as a group to be taken care by the government, but it would be difficult to identify who among the poor need help the most. There are many factors other than income and asset which are associated with poverty. For instance, the accessibility of basic education, healthcare, drinking water and sanitation. The mechanism for determining the poverty line also does not take into consideration social factors that trigger and perpetuate poverty, such as illiteracy, ill health, lack of access to resources, discrimination, or lack of civil and political freedom. The aim of poverty alleviation scheme should be to improve human life by expanding the range of things that a person could be and could do, such as to healthy and well nourished, to be knowledgeable and participate in a life of community. From this point of view, development is about removing the obstacles to the things that a person can do in life, such as illiteracy, ill health, lack of access to the resource, or lack of civil and political freedom. Though the government claims that higher rate of growth, increase in agricultural production, providing employment in rural areas and economic reform packages introduced in 1990s have resulted in decline in poverty level, economists raise doubt about the government's claim. They point out that the way the data are collected, items that are included in the consumption basket, methodology followed to estimate the poverty line and the number of poor are manipulated to arrive at the reduced figure of number of poor in India. Due to various limitations in the official estimation of poverty, scholars have attempted to find alternative methods. For instance, Amartya Sen, noted Nobel laureate, has developed an index known as Sen Index. There are other tools such as Poverty Gap Index and Squared Poverty Gap. You will learn about these tools in higher classes. The number of poor in India. When the number of poor is estimated as the proportion of people below the poverty line, it is known as head count ratio. Number of people who are poor. You might be interested in knowing the total number of poor persons residing in India. Where do they reside and has their number or proportion declined over the year or not? When such a comparative analysis of poor people is made, in terms of ratios and percentages, we will have an idea of different level of poverty of people and their distribution between states over time. The official data on poverty is made available to the public by Planning Commission. It is estimated on the basis of a consumption expenditure data collected by National Sample Survey Organization NSSO. Chart 4.3 shows the number of poor and their, so this is head count ratio is reducing. If you see number of poor also kind of reducing. Proportion to the population in India for the year 1973 to 2000. In 1973-74, more than 321 million people were below the poverty line. In 1999 to 2000, the number has come down to about 260 million. In terms of proportion, in 1973 to 74, about 55% of the total population was below the poverty line. In 1999 to 2000, it has fallen to 26%. In 1973 to 74, more than 80% of poor resided in rural areas, and in 1999-2000, this was come down about 75%. This means that more than 3/4 of the poor in India reside in villages. Also, poverty, which was prevailing predominantly in rural areas, has shifted to urban areas. In the 1990s, the absolute number of poor in rural areas had declined, whereas the number of their urban counterparts increased marginally. The poverty ratio declined continuously for both urban and rural areas. From chart 4.3, you will notice that during 1973 to 2000, there has been a decline in number of poor and their proportion, but the nature of decline in the two parameters is not encouraging. The ratio is declining much slower than absolute number of poor in the country. You will also notice that the gap between the absolute number of poor in rural and urban areas did not narrow down until the early 1990s, whereas in case of ratio, the gap has remained the same until 1999 to 2000. The state level trends in poverty are shown in the chart 4.4. It reveals that 5 states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal and Odisha, accounts for 70% of India's poor. So it's UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal and Orissa. You will also notice that during 1973-74, about half of the population in most of these large states have living below the poverty line. In 1999 to 2000, only 2 states, that is Bihar and Orissa, were left near that same level. Though they also reduced their share of poor compared to other states, their success is marginal. If we look at Gujarat, it reduces people below the poverty line from 48% to 15% during 1973 to 2000. During this period, West Bengal has been just as successful. From early 2/3, that is 63% of population below the poverty line, the same was reduced to about 27%. What causes poverty? Poverty is explained by individual circumstances and or characteristics of poor people. Some examples are low level of education skill, infirmity, ill health, sickness, discrimination. These can be caused as a result of social, economic, and political inequality, social exclusion, unemployment, indebtedness, unequal distribution of wealth. Aggregate poverty is just a sum of individual poverty. Poverty is also explained by general economy side problems such as low capital formation, lack of infrastructure, lack of demand, pressure of population, lack of social welfare nets. In chapter 1, you have read about British rule in India. Although the final impact of the British rule on Indian living standard is still being debated, there is no doubt that there was a substantial negative impact on the Indian economy and the standard of living of people. There was substantial deindustrialization in India under British rule. Imports of manufactured cotton cloth from Lancashire in England displaced much local production, and India reverted to being an exporter of cotton yarn, not the cloth. As over 70% of Indians were engaged in agriculture throughout the British Raj period, the impact on that sector was more important on living standard than anything else. British policies involved sharply rising rural taxes that enabled merchants and money lenders to become large landowners. Under the British, India began to export food grains, and as a result, as many as 26 million people died in famine between 1875 and 1900s. Britain's main goal from the Raj were to provide a market for British export, to have India service its debt payments to Britain, and for India to provide manpower for the British imperial armies. The British Raj impoverished a million of people in India. Our natural resources were plundered. Our industries worked to produce goods at low prices for British, and our food grains were exported. Many died due to famine and hunger. In 1957 to 58, hunger at the overthrow of many local leaders, extremely high taxes imposed on the peasants, and other resentments boiled over in a revolt against British rule by the sepoys, Indian troops commanded by the British. Even today, agriculture is the principal means of livelihood, and land is primary asset of rural people. Ownership of land is an important determinant of a material well-being, and those who own some land have a better chance to improve their living conditions. Since independence, the government has attempted to redistribute land and has taken land from those who have a large amount to distribute it to those who do not have any land but work on the land as wage worker laborers. However, this move was successful only in limited extent, as large sections of agricultural workers were not able to form the small holdings that they now possessed, as they did not have either money, asset, or skill to make the land productive, and land holdings were too small to be viable. A large section of the rural poor in India are small farmers. The land that they have is in general less fertile and dependent on rains. Their survival depends on subsistence crops and sometimes on livestock. With the rapid growth of population and without alternative sources of employment, the per head availability of land for cultivation has steadily declined, leading to fragmentation of land holdings. The income from these small land holdings is not sufficient to meet the family's basic requirement. You must have heard about farmers committing suicide due to their inability to pay back the loans that they have taken for cultivation and other domestic needs, as their crops have failed due to drought or other natural calamities. The scheduled caste and scheduled tribes are not able to participate in the emerging employment opportunity in different sectors of the urban and rural economy as they do not have necessary knowledge and skill to do so. The urban poor in India are largely the overflow of the rural poor who migrate to urban areas in search of employment and a livelihood. Industrialization has not been able to absorb all these people. Most of urban poor are either unemployed or intermittently employed as casual laborers. Casual laborers are among the most vulnerable in society as they have no job security, no assets, limited skills, sparse opportunities, and no surplus to sustain them. Poverty is therefore also closely related to nature of employment, unemployment or underemployment, and the casual and intermittent nature of work in both rural and urban areas that compels indebtedness in turn reinforce poverty. Indebtedness is one of the significant factors of poverty. A steep rise in price of food, grains and other essential goods at the rate higher than price of luxury goods further intensifies the hardship and deprivation of lower income groups. The unequal distribution of income and asset has also led to persistence of poverty in India. All this has created two distinct groups in society: those who possess the means of production and earn good incomes, and those who have only their labor to trade for survival. Over years, the gap between the rich and the poor in India was widened. Poverty is a multidimensional challenge for India that needs to be addressed on war footing. Policies and programs towards poverty alleviation. The Indian Constitution and 5-year plans state social justice as primary objective of the developmental strategy of government. To quote the first 5-year plan 1951 to 56, the urge to bring economic and social change under present condition comes from the fact of poverty and inequality in income, wealth and opportunity. The second 5-year plans 56 to 61 also pointed that the benefits of economic development must accrue more and more to the relatively less privileged classes of society. One can find in all policy documents emphasis being laid on poverty alleviation, and that various strategies need to be adopted by the government for the same. The government approach to poverty reduction was of three dimensions. The first one is growth oriented approach. It is based on expectation that the effects of economic growth, rapid increase in a gross domestic product and per capita income would spread to all sections of society and will trickle down to the poor section also. This was the major focus of planning in the 1950s and early 1960s. It was felt that rapid industrial development and transformation of agriculture through green revolution in select regions would benefit the underdeveloped regions and more backward section of the community. You must have read in chapter 2 and 3 that overall growth of agriculture and industry have not been impressive. Population growth has resulted in very low growth in per capita income. The gap between poor and rich actually widened. The Green Revolution exacerbated the disparities regionally and between large and small farmers. There was unwillingness and inability to redistribute land. Economists state that benefits of economic growth have not trickled down to the poor. While looking for alternatives to specifically address the poor, policymakers started thinking that income and employment for the poor could be raised through the creation of incremental assets and by means of work generation. This could achieved through specific poverty alleviation program. This second approach has been initiated from the third 5-year plan and progressively enlarged since then. One of the noted programs initiated in 1970s was Food for Work. The programs that are being implemented now are based on the perspectives of a 10th five-year plan. Expanding self-employment programs and wage employment programs are being considered as a major ways of addressing poverty. Example of self-employment program are Rural Employment Generation Program, Prime Minister Rozgar Yojana, and Swarna Jayanti Sahari Rozgar Yojana. The first program aimed at creating self-employment opportunity in rural and small towns. The Khadi and Village Industries Commission is implementing it. Under this program, one can get financial assistance in form of bank loans to set up small industries. The educated, unemployed from low-income families in rural and urban areas can get financial help to set up any kind of enterprise that generates employment under PMRY, SJSRY, mainly aim at creating employment opportunities, both self-employment and wage employment in urban areas. Earlier, under self-employment program, financial assistance was given to families or individuals since the 1990s. This approach has been changed now. Now those who wish to benefit from these programs are encouraged to form self-help groups. Initially, they are encouraged to save some money and lend among themselves as small loans. Later, through banks, the government provides partial financial assistance to self-help groups, which then decide whom the loan is to be given to for self-employment initiative. Swarna Jayanti Gram Swarojgar Yojana is one such program. The government has a variety of programs to generate wage employment for the poor, unskilled people living in rural areas. Some of them are National Food for Work Program and Swarna Gramin Rozgar Yojana. In August 2005, the Parliament has passed a new act to provide guaranteed wage employment to every household, those whose adult volunteer is to do unskilled manual work for minimum 100 days in a year. This act is known as National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005. Under this act, all those among the poor who are ready to work at a minimum wage can report for work in areas where this program is implemented. The third approach to addressing poverty is to provide minimum basic amenities to the people. India was among the pioneers in the world to envisage that through public expenditure and social consumption needs, provision of food grains at subsidized rates, education, health, water supply and sanitation, people's living standard could be improved. Programs under this approach are expected to supplement the consumption of poor, create consumption opportunity and bring about improvement in health and education. One can trace this approach from fifth five-year plan. Even with expanded employment opportunity, the poor will not be able to buy for themselves all essential goods and services. They have to be supplemented up to at least a certain minimum standard by social consumption and investment in form of essential food grains, education, health, nutrition, drinking water, housing, communication and electricity. Three major programs that aim at improving the food and nutritional status of the poor are Public Distribution System, Integrated Child Development Scheme, Midday Meal Scheme, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Gramodaya Yojana, Valmiki Ambedkar Awas Yojana. Also attempts in the same direction. It may be essential to briefly state that India has achieved satisfactory progress in many aspects. The government also has a variety of other social security programs to help a few specific groups. National Social Assistance Program is one such program initiated by the central government Under this program, elderly people who do not have anyone to take care of them are given pension to sustain themselves. Social assistance program. Poor women who are destitute and widows are also covered under this. Poverty alleviation program are critical assessment. Efforts at poverty alleviation have borne fruit in that for the first time since independence, the percentage of absolute poor in some states is now well below the national average. Despite a variety of approaches, programs, and schemes to alleviate poverty, hunger, malnutrition, malnourishment, illiteracy, and lack of basic amenities continue to be common features in many parts of India. Though the policy towards poverty alleviation has evolved in progressive manner over the last 5.5 decades, it has not undergone any radical transformation. You can find change in nomenclature, integration, or mutations of programs. However, none resulted in any radical change in the ownership of asset, process of production, and improvement of basic amenities to the needy. Scholars, while assessing these programs, state three major areas of concern which prevent their successful implementation. Due to unequal distribution of land and the other assets, the benefit from direct poverty alleviation program have been appropriated by the non-poor. Compared to the magnitude of poverty, the amount of resource allocated for this program is not sufficient. Moreover, these programs depend mainly on government and bank officials for their implementation. Since such officials are ill-motivated, inadequately trained, corruption-prone, and vulnerable to pressure from a variety of local elites, the resources are inefficiently used and wasted. There is also non-participation of local level institutions in program implementation. Government policies have also failed to address the vast majority of vulnerable people who are living on or just above poverty line. It also reveals that high growth alone is not sufficient to reduce poverty without the active participation of the poor. Successful implementation of any program is not possible. Poverty can effectively be eradicated only when the poor start contributing to growth by their active involvement in the growth process. This is possible through a process of social mobilization, encouraging poor people to participate and get them empowered. This will also help create employment opportunity, which may lead to increase in level of income, skill development, health and literacy. Moreover, it is necessary to identify poverty-stricken areas and provide infrastructure such as schools, roads, power, telecom, IT services, training institutions, etc.